Robocop Rogue City is quality 7 out of 10 fare. One of those games that lack the production values of an objectively higher scoring AAA title, but are often way more fun to play. How much you enjoy it though will depend on what you're willing to forgive to finally get a good game based on an underutilized IP. It shares many of the same highs and lows as Terminator Resistance, demonstrating a lot of passion and an obvious love for the IP. However, some great character interactions, solid shooting, an authentic sense of style, and a flashy new engine can't obscure the disjointed campaign flow, limited mechanical depth, dated character models, and truly awful cutscenes. If you've watched the 1987 film recently, it's easy to argue Robocop Rogue City retreads too many themes. What makes us human and who gets to decide? Is the rigid application of laws truly just? And is there no end to corporate greed and the collateral damage it causes? Repetition, sure, but these themes make for some of the best interactions between Robocop and the supporting cast, and they tie into a narrative role-playing mechanic that influences the fate of several characters and of old Detroit. That said, this is no subversive masterpiece. Robocop guns down hundreds of gang members with no consideration for the socio-economic manipulation that pushed them into that life, and there's no shortage of real-world examples that demonstrate trying to resolve violence with violence begets more violence. The events of Robocop Rogue City take place after the second film, with resurgent gangs, an ongoing drug problem, and the OCP still looking for any excuse to replace the police force with robots and level old Detroit to make way for their Delta City project. Robocop experiences more glitches during an attack on the Channel 9 building, so OCP inserts a chip to monitor his performance, which ties into the progression mechanics, and assigns him to some mandatory therapy sessions, which are used to define, question, or reinforce your role-playing choices. He's then let off the leash to investigate the new guy in town, a mysterious villain whom several gangs and mercenaries are all vying to work for. This kicks off an interesting but poorly paced story that revolves around Robocop in more ways than one. A good chunk of the opening half is spent shooting through several gangs to interrogate their leaders, destroying more dysfunctional Ed 209s, dealing with OCP's ongoing efforts to undermine the existing police force, avoiding or engaging with mayoral election campaigns intent on using him for political goals, and uncovering an even deeper conspiracy within the OCP that leads into a drawn-out finale in a bizarre final boss fight that I guess is somewhat foreshadowed. Now I know this is both a video game and Robocop is satirical sci-fi, but the plot is still full of contrivances, inconsistent logic, and sudden deviations that make it feel as though the script was written on the fly. That said, if you focus instead on the optional missions and the smaller moments between Robocop and Lewis, his fellow officers, the citizens of old Detroit, and even the antagonists, you'll find much better writing and unexpectedly touching moments, and you get the chance to explore lovingly recreated spaces, like the Metro West police station. Peter Weller's voice and delivery add instant authenticity, and, with the notable exception of OCP's CEO, the Old Man, the rest of the voice cast give it their all, even if most performances aren't going to win any awards. During many of these moments, you'll choose Robocop's response or actions, which don't drastically alter the events you experience, but they do change how he perceives himself and how the cast interacts with him down the line. The problem is, no matter how good Robocop Rogue City looks, with incredibly detailed environments, destruction physics, realistic lighting, and exaggerated gore, the vast majority of character models look dated and stiffly animated. Lip-syncing is all over the place. The world is static and unresponsive, and the cutscene direction feels surprisingly crude. Think simplistic framing, awkward cuts, poor dialogue delivery, and shifting sound levels. Robocop's model looks great, Weller's delivery is perfect, and the soundtrack variations of the original theme are brilliant, but all that can't stop many cutscenes robbing the game of the emotional impact the writers clearly intended. Now, I've got this far without discussing the gameplay in depth, and I'd argue that's because there's not a lot of depth. Well, at least not when tackling all the primary and secondary missions can take almost 20 hours, alternating between corridor shooting galleries and repeat visits to a hub like old Detroit that evolves over time. Mechanically, Robocop Rogue City is another RPG shooter hybrid like Terminator Salvation, albeit with less looting, crafting and upgrading gear, and a greater focus on satisfying gunplay based around Robocop's iconic Auto 9 and his incredible resilience. There are simple dialogue and scanning-based investigations, but while some of the larger chapters and the old Detroit hub often reminded me of Eidos Montreal's Deus Ex games, Robocop is no Adam Jensen. Even if the mission starts off peaceful, it's guaranteed to end in a gunfight. Thankfully, the shooting is solid and Robocop Rogue City nails the sensation of being half man and half machine, with the durability and maneuverability of a tank. I'd always laugh when yet another gang member or mercenary threatened Robocop and pulled out a handgun or rifle, as only high-caliber rounds and explosives pose a significant threat. From the moment Robocop thuds into the Channel 9 building, draws his iconic Auto 9 and the classic theme kicks in, you'll spend most of your time shooting enemies in the head, in the groin if they're armoured, or in weak points if they're robotic. Although you can carry another weapon in reserve, the customizable Auto 9 with unlimited ammo is your workhorse tool, and clearly received the most attention. Firefights are fairly dynamic and evolve to a degree, just not enough to sustain a campaign twice the length of the classic first-person shooters that clearly inspired it. Enemies with more armor, bigger guns, or special abilities are slowly introduced. Environments are full of hazards you can throw at enemies or throw enemies into. Most secondary weapons are useful in specific situations, and there are offensive and defensive skills you can put points into for incremental buffs and perks. You can also upgrade the Auto 9 using PCB omniboards and chips, which feels like a less intuitive variation of what we got in Terminator Resistance. The problem is that it takes hours to get impactful perks if you don't take the min-max approach. Think deadly ricochet shots, bullet deflecting armor, and bursts of slow motion that actually last long enough to be useful. All the while there's a steady increase in the number of tankish enemies that offset their impact and drag out firefights. As I was blasting through an endgame gauntlet, about 18 hours in, I realized I was just going through the same motions on autopilot. Pull the left trigger, smile as the CRT effect and targeting outlines appeared, pull the right trigger, and watch heads or groins explode. Considered in isolation, most scripted firefights are entertaining, but there are a lot of them, and they all blur together over time. Now, despite ending on a low note, Teon still deserves plenty of praise for creating the best Robocop video game available, just as they did for the Terminator IP, and that makes this a must-play for fans of Terminator Salvation. For those not part of that crowd, Robocop Rogue City can still be a lot of fun if you're heavily invested in the IP, and can look past inconsistent production values or underdeveloped systems. It somewhat outstays its welcome, but provides a unique opportunity to roleplay a conflicted Robocop, violently prosecuting justice through a CRT filter to a fantastic soundtrack. If nothing else, it might also convince you the IP could work in a dedicated narrative adventure game.
If you've got this far, please consider giving the video a like and maybe subscribing to our channel, as it helps us grow.